We are approaching the end of this series, and we are always ignorant of endings. A life with total knowledge of how it unfolded and ended would be both godlike and unbearable. It is our ignorance of the future which shields us from horrors to come, which allows for future revelations and delights.
You may deliberately sequester yourself from some kinds of information, such as the spoiler alert.
Steven Pinker.
If there's a mystery, you really don't want to know who done it, so that you can enjoy the pleasure of suspense and resolution. You may want to kind of sequester yourself until you get a chance to go home and watch the match. If you know how it turns out, that takes away the pleasure.
There can be no punchlines without ignorance. But ignorance in life is something beyond ignorance in art. Even Hamlet, with all its power, ambiguity, and possibility, is still only an object in space written 400 years ago. But our lives are not a text accessible in a library. Our happiness, as Aristotle observes, is not a state, but an activity through time. We seek a meaning of which we are still ignorant. Our futures, we sense, are uncertain and undetermined. They can be shaped, and they might still be redeemed. This is the bedrock of our very idea of free will. Someone who knew everything that was about to happen, who was not ignorant of the future, would have nothing to discover, no agency, no choice, no life worth living at all. The first and perhaps greatest meditation on ignorance was written by a medieval polymath, Nicholas of Cusa. A powerful and original mathematician with a thirst for learning and an encyclopedic memory, he observes,
"How needful it is for me to enter into the darkness and admit the coincidence of opposites, beyond all grasp of reason, and there to seek the truth, where impossibility meeteth me."
The coincidence of opposites runs through our discovery that ignorance is often knowledge, and to be knowledgeable is often to be ignorant. All of this can seem incomprehensible, frustrating, even enraging. But that's because we're struggling to see knowledge and ignorance as anything other than contradictions. Nicholas of Cusa's phrase, "the coincidence of opposites," suggests a different kind of relationship. Ignorance doesn't cancel out knowledge in the way that 1 plus minus 1 equals 0. As the poet William Blake wrote,
"There is a negation, and there is a contrary."
Ignorance, in Blake's words, is a contrary to knowledge, but it's not a negation. Instead, the relationship between the two ideas creates something new.
Neither are good or bad, only too much of one is not good.
To fly, we require the wing of knowledge to be as strong as the wing of ignorance. Without ignorance, there's no privacy, creativity, or fairness. But focusing only on your ignorance can engender a paralyzing pessimism. Without knowledge, there's no information, self-knowledge, or truth. But focusing only on how much you know and knowing more can make you arrogant, overconfident, dogmatic, technocratic, and intrusive. Or it can bias you, or it can make you paranoid or even overwhelm you. So you must work continually to deepen both your ignorance and your knowledge and learn how to use their relationship to transcend both. It's as though combining 1 with -1 created not 0, but a new miracle. This dialectic is at the core of our ability to think, create, develop, love, govern, and be wise. And this is why this series is ultimately not an argument for ignorance only, but for strengthening ignorance and knowledge simultaneously.
In the way in which we talk now, there are things that are good, and they are goals to be pursued. And it doesn't matter how far you pursue them, they are still good.
Ian McGilchrist.
But unfortunately, they bring with them their shadow side. And it's this shadow side that we're completely ignorant of because of our belief that things are cut and dried and simple and they belong to two camps, the good and the bad. But the things that we consider good, if pursued too far, will bring with them evil, and not only just some evil, but the very evil that was being fled from. So, for example, the classic example is freedom is a good, but freedom stretched so far that it produces anarchy leads to tyranny, the absence of freedom. And I think that if only we could see that we are always balancing things, a thing and its opposite at the same time, holding them together, not just finding a midpoint, but actually honorably holding both of them to be important, we would be in a much better place today than we are.
Not a weaker, diluted form of knowledge and ignorance, but a stronger sense of both.
I sometimes say, if you want a really good apple pie, you don't take bland apples, you take tart apples and put honey with it.
The boundary between knowledge and ignorance is never static. We are always dealing with the limits of knowledge. But we must explore and respond to those limits in every conceivable way. In episode 1, we saw that knowledge can become a fence that traps us. In episode 2, we saw ignorance as a frontier which the scientist seeks to expand. In episode 3, it's a prison wall which the artist leaps for inspiration. In episode 4, the politician or civil servant carefully maps the boundary between knowledge and ignorance, using its contours to design new democratic institutions. In episode 5, the conspiracy theorist fantasizes that there are no limits to what he can know, but others build screens of ignorance. Finally, in this episode, the limit of knowledge and ignorance is no longer a barrier to be feared or defined, erected or dismantled, manned or pushed over, but a veil between the material and the spiritual, the symbol of the ineffable and the transcendent. In each case, as Nicholas of Cusa says, the coincidence of opposites generates something new, and not through watering down. The aim is not to find the midpoint of a stick between the two poles of ignorance and knowledge, but instead to connect them with a string, turning them into a bow, and using the energy of their opposing forces to shoot the arrow. So the balance between knowledge and ignorance in private life is not a tepid and polite engagement with the other. Instead, it rests on a double strengthening, an ever deeper knowledge of your partner and an ever deeper sense of their mystery and unknowability. In the relationship, we should push both for ever greater intimacy and for greater autonomy for the other. Two wings of the bird, neither indifference nor jealousy, but trust. In science, we might call the miracle of this dynamic between knowledge and ignorance discovery. In art, creativity. In personal development, equanimity. In public life, we call it prudence and justice. But in every case, we are harnessing, balancing, and deepening knowledge and ignorance. Everything begins with the wonder of knowledge, but it's through the dance with ignorance that knowledge becomes wisdom. The Long History of Ignorance is written and presented by me,